Well, my greetings to all of you, and welcome to today's web chat. I'm Bill Magwood. I'm Director General of the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency, and I'm very pleased to be hosting yet another discussion with an important figure from one of our member countries. Before I begin, let me just pass my hope to all of you that you and your families are very healthy during this unusual period. Obviously, one outcome of the pandemic has been that we have been using web tools like this to reach more people and to have vibrant discussions on a wide range of issues. I hope it's something we continue to do as time goes on. Today's guest is Shawn Tupper. Shawn was appointed Associate Deputy Minister of Natural Resources Canada in November 2018. Previously, he was Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet at the Privy Council office, where he was responsible for economic and regional development policy. Shawn has an abiding interest in the public policy objective of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, which he's worked on in several positions that he's held in government, and also as Director General of the Indian Residential Schools Resolution Canada. So Shawn, please join me on camera, and look forward to our conversation today. So perhaps you have a few opening comments before we start interrogating
you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, and greetings to everybody. I sit in Ottawa virtually, but in Ottawa, we stand on the lands of the unceded and traditional territories of the Algonquin people. And I think that will be an aspect of our conversation today is reconciliation and our engagement with Indigenous people. And these are important recognitions for us as Canadians to acknowledge the First Peoples who inhabited our lands here. So thank you very much for this invitation. I look forward to our conversation.
Looking to it very much, and since you brought up your work with Indigenous people, perhaps I'll just ask you to elaborate a bit. What has been your what's made this such an abiding interest for you? Just curiosity. Why did you get involved in this and stay with it for so many parts of your career?
Well, growing up in Western Canada, the proximity of some very large Indigenous communities to the city I grew up in Calgary kind of presented that reality to me throughout my childhood, that we shared land with First Nations in Alberta, and it wasn't always a good picture for me as we, I grew up in a middle class home in a nice neighborhood. I went to school. I had both my parents at home, but it was a visible reality for us that Indigenous people didn't necessarily live the same way that we did. And so, I pursued that in my studies at university. And then subsequent in my career in government, I spent 10 years, probably, frankly, kind of starting the initial work within the federal system around what we call today reconciliation. And it was focused on the impact of the Indian residential school system that took kids from their homes with the purpose of basically making them white, not acknowledging their culture, not acknowledging their systems and their communities, but taking kids into what were largely church-run schools. The impact of that was devastating. And so I led the charge, pardon me, in developing a strategy that would respond to that legacy and try to start that process of reconciliation. And so it's just been something that really has marked me. And frankly, I will carry with me all my life in terms of understanding, frankly, what human beings can do to one another, the impact of colonialism, that sense of superiority that some cultures carried through the 17th, 18th, even into the 19th century. And these are things that we struggle with today in terms of the impacts on our community and the health and well-being of Canadians.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. I mean, certainly, North America as a whole has a very problematic history and a lot of complicated issues that remain to this day. And in the various jobs that I've had over the years, I've had interactions with tribal governments, and it's always been a very both enriching and also very sometimes depressing experience for a variety of reasons. So perhaps that's something you and I can chat about offline at some point after we're able to travel and get together again. Of course, the immediate crisis everyone is dealing with is the pandemic, and this has affected the whole world, obviously, as we were saying a few minutes ago. And perhaps just to get our conversation started, what's been the impact on what you do in your portfolio of work? Where have you had to make changes to continue doing the work of Natural Resources Canada?
It's been quite fascinating, actually. We in Canada, about mid-March, which I think would be where the world really became seized with what was going on and the impacts of COVID, and we'd watch what was going on in Asia, and certainly as in North America, we really started to understand what the potential risks for North Americans were. And so we closed down our office in mid-March, sent everybody home. We had no idea exactly how long that was going to last or what impact that was going to have. We moved immediately to try and equip our teams to be able to work remotely. And that was something I suspect every office has struggled with over the last few years, as we've kind of thought about work-life balance and can we have people working remotely, and managers not sure whether that would work. And now all of a sudden we were forced into that very context that we had to make sure that our folks could be productive and that we could continue to run a country. So the biggest struggle was frankly finding our feet in terms of being able to work collaboratively, work horizontally, and in kind of developing advice for our government that had to confront this crisis head on. We also had to, though, and kind of again a reflection, I think, to our first comments about the experience of Indigenous Canadians in our country. We also had to kind of look at what the impacts were of COVID on our employees, some of whom are young, some of whom are living in very small apartments, perhaps with a partner, perhaps with small children. And all of a sudden we were saying, be productive for 7.5 hours a day and do it sitting on a bed, kind of on a laptop that might be on a desk or maybe on a bedroom sort of cabinet or something. And kind of having to really realize people's circumstances are different, and COVID has impacted people differently, and there are vulnerable populations in our world that have had a much bigger impact than, say, I have, sitting in my home with a big office and pretty comfortable and I can make do. We had to think about, for women, are we sending them back home and saying work from home in an environment where they're not necessarily safe? And so as employers, we had to really think about not just work productivity and kind of managing our files, but we had to kind of think about the safety, the well-being of our employees, and how we could ensure that they'd survive all of this. Work with industry changed. The way we collaborate. This is a fantastic thing that I think is the outcome of COVID, that realization that you and I could talk every day if we wanted. Whereas I don't think we would have had that kind of frame of mind 10 months ago. And so I think that those are big differences that we see today than we saw last March.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see maybe 2 years from now what stays. What are the permanent changes? I don't know that we can tell that yet, but I suspect that there are some permanent changes. I mean, as I heard you describing the considerations that you had when you were related to your employees, I think it's changed the employee-employer relationship in many ways. I think employers are now, or supervisors and managers are now much more involved in the personal aspect of the reality that people actually live in, because we're going to be asking them to do more from home, and if they're at home, do they have kids? And if they have kids, how are they dealing with that? And while they're trying to get meetings done. I mean, these are conversations that supervisors never had to deal with before, but now it's become part of the lexicon. And so I think this is going to have far-reaching long-term impacts. We just don't know exactly what yet. And regarding the work of your agency, you have a lot of international relationships. I'm sure the pandemic has affected those as well.
Absolutely. I would say it's been disruptive. There's no question. Things that we imagined we could only do in person, conferences and whatnot. And I think the immediate period of the COVID response and reaction was very disruptive. And I think we all kind of had to figure it out. But I find it fascinating now. I sat on the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, in a colloquium with colleagues from the UK. And I got to say, we had a productive, enlightening, and really thorough conversation about nuclear. And it was fascinating to kind of think what is possible now. And so it says to me that, in fact, international collaboration, our ability to work together, our ability to find those allegiances that we look for in terms of advancing kind of, issues and files that we share. I actually think, as you say, the future looks kind of brighter in that sense, insofar as we can do more. We've never had our minister as public as he has been over the last 6 months. His ability to get to a G20, get to a G7, get to hydrogen ministerials or energy ministerials or the IEA. It's been fascinating, the amount of activity he's had internationally that we would never have had if we were just kind of taking our traditional approach of getting him on a plane and being out of Ottawa for 5 days or something like that.
Well, I think we've had very similar experiences with the NEA. We've had more interaction with more people at different levels than we have had in a long time. As you'll recall, we had the virtual mission to Canada during August, and normally when we do our missions, it might be me and perhaps one or two other senior staff that will go with me. But this time we had, half a dozen or more senior staff participating in these discussions. It would have been impossible with an in-person meeting. So I mean, you can immediately see the advantages of using these technologies. But at the same time, I think we all missed the personal interaction. Those informal lunches where you really get to know people and you get to have these quiet conversations. That you lose that. So we're gaining some things, we're losing some things, and there'll be a balance in the future, but it's hard to know what it'll look like. Of course, I know, one of the things that's been really interesting to watch around the world, and I'll appreciate your views on this, is as countries have moved so aggressively to declare carbon neutrality, but usually by 2050, and Canada has made this declaration as well. And as we have these international conversations, sometimes you get the sense that countries have made these statements. I'm obviously not going to name countries I think fall in this category, have made these strong statements, but have absolutely no idea how they're going to get to these goals. And this is really one of those issues that just doesn't lend itself to hope and a prayer. You have to have clear planning, clear intention. Among the countries that we deal with, Canada clearly has been a country that has given a great deal of thought to this and done a lot of work. So your perspective is going to be very interesting. What do you see as the building blocks of being able to really get to carbon neutrality? Not just talk about it, but really achieve it by 2050.
I think that is a shift that has occurred in this last year. We've got to stop talking about utopia. We've got to stop just talking about what our targets are, but actually articulate the plan, starting with tomorrow and the days thereafter. And I think in Canada, that has been a fundamental shift in the conversation, is exactly as you say, what are the building blocks to kind of getting there? And I think what that's allowed is it's taken away some of the competition of ideas. So in the energy sector, for instance, there is a steadfast argument about whether the petroleum sector, whether the alternatives, and then indeed nuclear. And I think historically there's been a lot of discussion about the competition of those energy sources, and now we're talking about how do we bring them all together for a comprehensive plan? How do we understand the energy system and each of the component parts that make up that system? And so now we can talk about nuclear complementing our strategies around alternative fuels, that we can look at nuclear as a baseload supply upon which we can build our alternative strategy. And they don't have to be either or. As the minister says, it's and. I think that's a fundamental shift, because I think that really is now allowing us to be pragmatic. In Canada, the energy sector makes up almost 20% of our GDP. It is not an easy thing to just kind of say we will be carbon neutral in 2050 without articulating a plan for a fifth of our economy. And so that's been, I think, the major achievement over the last year, is that ability to kind of talk in a systems-oriented way, putting things in their proper context.
And what in that context, I mean, you know, Canada is a major producer of fossil fuels. Where's the future if we're talking about carbon neutral future? What happens to that industry? It's a huge industry in Canada. How do you think about that? How do you interact with the industry? How do you talk to the affected populations? What are you saying to them today?
Well, a lot of countries have had this experience already with respect to coal. And in Canada, we talk about the just transition as we move away from workers. And we're going to have exactly the same conversation with respect to the oil and gas sector. But I think the other thing that we have to really be focused on, particularly in Canada, if we think about who's making the investment in clean tech, who's talking about carbon capture and all of those things that are going to be instrumental, that they're going to be key to succeeding at our cheap energy industry. 7 in Canada in clean tech are made out of the energy sector. So for us, it's about partnership. It's about bringing them into the tent and kind of actually learning from them. In many respects, the energy industry is leading. You know, BP, Shell, Suncor, Cenovus, they've all started to make that transition. They talk about them being energy companies as opposed to petroleum companies. They're already making that transition. So I think it's about how we collaborate with them and find that path together. And I think that's what the government's mission is, working with regional governments or provincial governments. That's the key part of the conversation.
You know, when you go to many international meetings about climate change, there's a couple of dynamics that I find quite interesting, and I'm sure you've seen this as well. And there's lots of meetings that take place where no one talks about energy, which I find to be one of the more interesting things that have happened. And people can talk for climate change for hour after hour and never mention energy. And I know why, because that's the core of the issue, but it's also the hardest to fix. That's one of the reasons they don't talk about it. But then when they do talk about energy, they focus almost exclusively on renewables. And obviously Canada is deploying renewables very, very aggressively. And Canada has already been very clear that renewables are a big part of the solution. But I think it's also been clear from the Canadian standpoint that renewables is not the only part of the answer. It's, as you said, it's and. So what can you speak to that? What do you view as this nuclear and renewables discussion internationally, and how do you see it playing out? And then how do you see it in Canada?
Well, again, I think it is about finding those venues where we can kind of voice the whole of the discussion to make sure that we have a complete understanding of the choices that are in that energy mix, that we're comparing apples to apples. One of the struggles I have in the debate between, say, nuclear and alternatives is we don't compare costing. And so there is this argument out there that alternatives have kind of hit that point where they're cheaper. Well, right now, most of the costing, comparisons I've seen, we fully cost the whole life cycle of nuclear, and we don't see that in a lot of what we see in the analysis of alternatives. And so we've got to get to a point in those venues where we're having the complete conversation and we're comparing apples to apples to kind of make sure that we're seeing some of that reality. In Canada, I want to emphasize, since 2017, we've spent something in the range of $3 billion on carbon capture, storage, wind, solar power, alternative fuels. Like we've made a huge commitment there. And now I think we are in a world where in those provinces that have the advantage of hydro, it's a much easier conversation to talk about that integration of hydro and how it provides that that base load upon which we can look at these alternatives. Those provinces that don't have that advantage and are currently, either moving away from coal now or have moved away from coal, but still rely, for instance, on natural gas for power generation, they've got to kind of make some of those choices about where their base load is going to come. And that's where SMRs have really started to kind of pop up. We have seen currently, non-nuclear provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta sign on to MOUs with the nuclear provinces to kind of say, we're interested in this next generation, these new technologies, because they can help us meet our energy demand in a cleaner way. And I think, again, that's an indicator that people are starting to see energy systems and the kinds of choices that we have to make in a much longer term way. And I think that's to everybody's advantage.
I appreciate that. I think that's the experience that we've had, that that's going to be very important for each country to look at its specific situation, to look at what its costs are, what its resources are, and then to do its planning based on that, not on general principles, but on the facts on the ground. And that's, we've been trying to help with that. We've been offering some support to some of our member countries to do analysis like that. But I think that's where the future is taking us, that kind of careful, practical consideration of the facts. And by the way, we'll soon be releasing the NEA IEA joint study called Projected Costs of Generating Electricity, and that will, I think, help because we're able to show the apples to apples comparison that you spoke about.
It's a challenge. In a country like Canada, second largest country in the world, we articulate, policy principles, broad frameworks. But at the end of the day, just as you were describing, the energy choices of Alberta and Saskatchewan are fundamentally different than the energy choices of Ontario and Quebec and British Columbia, for instance. How we bring power generation into the north and remote communities where we currently don't have the billions of dollars of investment in infrastructure. Those are the questions that we have to think about, be guided by principle, but make, kind of local choices, realistic choices for the local economies that exist across the vast country that we're a part of.
Yeah, when you speak about principles, it reminds me that you have spoken in the past about the need to achieve both energy security and energy equity. And I wonder if you could explain what you mean by that. What do you mean by energy equity?
Well, I think it probably right now means a little bit something different to everybody who talks about it, because I think that's frankly one of the challenges we have is try to figure out how we develop energy systems, how we make energy accessible to people and to companies for that matter in ways that reflect reality. And so for us, equity is about energy poverty. One of the things I challenge my department on is it's not just enough to talk about how we generate electricity, for instance. We have to talk about if a Canadian comes home and has to think about flicking the lights on because of the affordability of their electricity bill. And those are real challenges. And so we want to think much more broadly about what now I think everybody's talking about, which is ESG, and thinking not just the economics, as I say, and the project dimension of this, but think about climate, think about social policy, think about governance. And so for us, that has allowed us to particularly pay attention to challenges like the role of women in the sector who are clearly underrepresented. And so equity in that sense matters to us in terms of having a diverse and inclusive sector. Equity also, I think, matters globally. How do we work together to kind of figure out, there's a developmental, element to this. And I think in the SMR context, that's really truly the case. Do SMRs give us opportunities to see development in areas of the globe that just currently can't afford to kind of make the investments that they want to make? And so that geopolitical element of this, I think, is critical as we think of governments. How do we work not to just build a sector that's inclusive and diverse, but equally a sector that actually can power the world in a way that currently we struggle with?
I feel like that a lot of these areas could be a 3-hour conversation onto themselves, and And one thing that you said that struck me was the necessity of making sure that people don't have to choose between food and electricity. But historically, the mechanism that many people have advocated to force changes in society because of climate change has been to increase electricity prices and to make electricity more expensive. So which way is it going to be? Are we going to have more expensive electricity, or are we going to have more electricity? How are we going to figure this out?
Well, happily for me, the provinces are responsible for the utilities, and they have to worry about ratepayers. That's not so. Well, it is so, but I think the federal government, I'm joking just to be clear, but I think, for us, obviously cost is something that we have to pay attention to, but I think it's the and part. How do we look at efficiency? How do we look at homes and buildings and think about investments that we can make around energy and efficiency? How do we retool? How do we do the retrofits that can allow us to increase our activity, but not necessarily increase demand and increase costs? And what are the most cost-effective investments that we can make that help us manage and regulate the rates that consumers pay? And so again, I think it's systems. It is about looking at the connectivity across that toolkit that we have that will allow us to kind of meet the climate objectives we have, but pay attention to the impact on consumers.
At the end of the day, this is about how we interact with the public. So this is really a stakeholder issue, isn't it? It's really communicating with stakeholders, getting their voices into the process to see where they agree. How do you think that will work in Canada? Is it going to be a constant back and forth between government and the public on all these issues?
I think that's unavoidable, frankly, whether we thought it a good idea or not. I think social media, these kinds of venues have made it so that everybody can speak up, and many more voices are heard than certainly was the case, 30 years ago when I was starting my career, and you had to hit the road and get it out into meeting rooms across the country to really engage with people. And so now I think we've got the tools and the ability to engage, and I think that's important. I think people expect now that their voices will be heard. The struggle for government will be, and nuclear is a perfect example. There are people who have legitimate concerns about the future of nuclear and the safety of nuclear, and we hear that, right? The pro and anti-nuclear debate. That engagement is going to be critical to finding that common place, that point where we can say we've got the right balance of allowing the sector to continue to advance, allowing the investments in next generation technologies, but addressing the concerns that people have about the safety, how we manage risk, and all of that. And that engagement is the only way we're going to find a reasonable outcome in that, I think.
In my experience in the different jobs I've had in government, whenever issues related to nuclear, particularly uranium mining, because of the history, things like that, there's always been a lot of concern and skepticism in Indigenous communities. In Canada, I have the sense that the relationship has been a bit more positive. Can you talk about that? Because I find that really quite interesting, because you've had a lot of engagement with Indigenous peoples as you've gone forward with the SMR strategies and other work like the Canadian Minerals and Metals plan that you put together. Can you talk about the experience that you've had in that area?
Well, I think key to a lot of our success is making sure that we acknowledge the importance of that Indigenous voice in what we're doing. They are not just stakeholders. They are an important, piece of the fabric of Canada that we need to kind of make sure that they are included and that they have voice and that they've got power, that they've got an ability to influence decisions. So just a really direct engagement with Indigenous leadership and communities is critical. I think the acknowledgement, as we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, around reconciliation and the aspects of reconciliation that are about economic reconciliation. So our ability to make sure that Indigenous people benefit from economic development, that they can thrive, as every Canadian deserves to do, as we see the nuclear sector advance. And so in the mining side, we've got deposits in Saskatchewan. Cameco is a major mining company here in Canada. And they are one of the leading employers of Indigenous people in the province of Saskatchewan. And they have just made it, part of their cultural creed that they are going to engage and they're going to employ, the people from the communities in which they operate. And the benefit of that is the community gets economic wealth, and within their communities that's generated. We're trying to do the same thing as we engage on SMRs, is trying to figure out, what is the perspective. Indigenous people have perspectives, for instance, on environmental protections. And so looking at how we manage the risks of waste. But equally, as we think about, potentially, I've seen, estimates of anywhere from 150 to $300 billion of a global, potential market by 2040 for SMRs. If Canada wants to play in that and wants to seize, some part of that global market, how do we make sure that we distribute the economic benefit of that to all Canadians, including Indigenous Canadians? And so, we're engaging, with agencies like the First Nations Power Authority to kind of make sure that they're a part of the conversation.
So you mentioned some big numbers there with SMRs. So it sounds like you're excited about SMRs.
I am. So I carry the responsibility within, the public service of providing, policy advice on nuclear to the government. So it's one of my big files, so to speak. It was an exciting thing to arrive to. When I was at the Privy Council office, I had kind of seen more distantly the ideas around SMRs and had kind of participated in meetings that talked about the technology and kind of the nuclear equation of kind of where SMRs might take us. But since I've arrived in the department, I realized that it's a much bigger story than the fact, Canada is a tier 1 nuclear country and this is the next wave and we've got the capacity and all of that, because there's all this other stuff that comes from it. The ability to look at how we can use small modular reactors in our oil sands to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of oil production, how we can look at SMRs as a way to provide power in remote communities, particularly Indigenous communities that currently rely on diesel. And so we can give them a clean alternative source of energy in a remote space in Canada. Mining benefits, the opportunity to provide power through SMRs in our north allows us to think about economic development in the north that otherwise we don't think about because it's just bloody expensive. Desalinization, providing heat. It's such a big story. It's not just kind of the nuclear it's a new technology, it's cool and it's the next generation, but it's this fascinating story about how it contributes to the climate plan and everything else. It truly is exciting.
So when you think about such a big global market, what do you think of, because there's many countries that haven't quite come around to the level of focus that Canada has. Do you think it just takes having the product, or do you think there's going to be a revelation that we need another tool in the toolbox to meet our objectives? What do you think will drive other countries to get to where Canada is today on SMRs?
Well, partly it is going to take those countries that can to actually move SMRs forward. And so, we've been engaged with conversations with the United States and with the UK and with Japan to kind of talk about how do we move an agenda forward that is supportive of SMRs and how it integrates into the energy mix. And so partly it is just about the countries that are capable of doing it. And so getting our laboratories collaborating, getting our regulators collaborating, looking at standard setting, a lot of the things that bilateral and multilateral cooperation can do. I think then it is a question of saying, and we've got to define what that global marketplace looks like. I mentioned earlier the opportunity to see development in places in the globe, much like Canada's North, where currently the cost of electricity and infrastructure investment is just prohibitive to see broader economic development. That will fundamentally shift the way countries can kind of choose to pursue their economic viability. And I think that's just super important. And I think it is just a question now of countries making the move to get the product onto the market.
So when you sort of step back and you look at where we are today with the climate change agenda, the decarbonization agenda, do you think the world's in moving in the right place, in the right direction? Do you feel optimistic about where we are today and where we need to go? Do you feel like the global conversation is going in the right direction? How do you feel about it when you look at the big picture?
I mean, as I said earlier, I do think there has been a bit of a shift in the last year where that conversation has become more concrete. That has to be good. I think, you know, the leadership that our British friends are showing in the run up to the next COP meeting in Scotland, in Glasgow, I think for Canada, we're really trying to plot out the opportunities that we have. What are the milestones? What are the things we can do on the road to the next COP meeting to kind of make sure that we are articulating a climate agenda that is achievable? We have to get through a world where we set targets and fail to meet them. We have to be able to, I mean, the time now more than ever before, and we've known this for a long time, you know, what is happening in the global environment, but now we need to make sure that governments are working together, agencies are collaborating in ways that get us to those concrete outcomes that allow us to say we're actually, you know, hitting those targets that we're setting for ourselves, and as you said earlier, not just talking about them.
Yeah. So you mentioned COP26. So what's success look like for COP26?
I'm not the lead, my department's not the lead on that, so I better be careful what I say, but I do think we need to kind of see a global effort that is concrete. So I do think, for instance, when I was in the UK last year, we talked about making sure there was a dialogue about the role that nuclear will play in meeting our climate objectives. So one of the things we are interested in is will we find a way to get to that sweet spot where the world can say, yes, nuclear is clean, it's non-emitting, it has the same challenge as any other energy source, you know, even alternatives. You know, if you think about wind power and all the copper and all the mining that goes into the wiring and all of the stuff, if you think about photovoltaics and batteries, you know, we've got to think about recycling and storage. Like nuclear is just like all of them. And we've got to get to that point where we can be realistic in that conversation and that we can say that these are all of the things that will contribute to meeting those goals. And nuclear has to be a part of that equation to seriously get to net zero by 2050.
Is another way of saying what you've been saying, that we're to move away from a more ideological approach to the energy questions and more to a practical approach. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
I have never said it publicly before, but I do think it is a little, you know, move away from your camps and figure out how we're going to collaborate to kind of achieve the goals. I absolutely, I think that's where we got to go.
You know, Canada is a very interesting country in a lot of ways because while it's the second largest country by, I guess, is it by surface area? Is that how you measure that? I forgot what the measure is. Right. It's actually population-wise actually quite small, but economically a big player. But so Canada is a country that sometimes it looks like a small country in some ways. It looks like a big country in other ways. It depends on how you look at it. And one area where Canada does seem to be a big country is in this whole SMR conversation. It seems like Canada is taking a real global leadership role here. Is that something that the Canadian government's advocating, to take a leadership role, to really be out in front? Is that something that you want to do?
I think so. I think my minister certainly over this past year has I think given a fairly clear indication of our approach to SMRs and the strategy for moving it forward. The government in 2018 launched our SMR roadmap, which kind of framed out elements of the succeed. And that map included, making sure that we advanced the policy dialogue, that our regulator was involved early, and really was able to kind of move in a direction that they would be able to do the work they need to do as these new technologies are advanced. The collaboration internationally, I think, has been a big component. We've been working with companies that have set up shop in Canada, who are advancing specific technologies, and we're talking to them about costing and financing. So I think, one of the things we've been trying to do is kind of look at all the pillars that make up that roadmap and make sure that they're advancing. I think that's what Canada, with greatest respect to everybody who's on this webcast, I think that's where Canada has led, is our ability to kind of look at all of the component pieces and advance them. And so we, I think, have built a pretty good environment here. The reality for Canada, as is the case in many of the subsectors of the energy system, we have the luxury of being able to argue that we can go from soup to nuts on SMRs. We've got the raw material in the ground. We've got the ability to process that material and ultimately to manufacture it and create the high-end value at the end of the supply chain. It's a nice position to be in. That we can realistically say that total value chain could exist in Canada. We know globally that that's not a perfect solution. So, the collaboration, as I say, that we're doing with other countries will be critical to making sure those supply chains are really secured, and that we've got the advantage to compete globally. Frankly, with markets that are at odds with our approach to the marketplace. I think, the reality of state-owned enterprises who are also moving in this area, that is a challenge for us. They have certain advantages because of the ability of their state to intervene and direct. So the better we do collaboratively through these bilateral and multilateral approaches, that's what's going to make Western economies competitive. And so we want to be a part of that, and we think we can play a leadership role in that.
When you talk about the collaboration part of it, what do you think countries need to do together? Where does, when you look at, organizations like the NEA, for example, multilateral institutions, or with your multilateral relationships, you've talked about your relationship with UK and US, for example. What do countries need to do together to make SMR successful? What are the pieces that need to be in place for success?
Well, I think the leadership that our regulators in all three of those countries have been playing in terms of the collaboration among themselves to kind of understand the technology, what is shifting as a result of the introduction of these technologies that are different, say in the Canadian case from CANDU, and making sure we're ready. And that, I think, establishes a platform that allows us to say we're managing the risks, and we've got a framework in place that allows us to move together. And I think that collaboration among countries allows us to benefit from each other's expertise and experience in that respect. Standard setting, that's something I think we've talked about in other panels together. That sense of we don't want a bunch of different technologies out there that are operating with different parameters. We need that certainty, and I think that security to kind of say that there is a global understanding of standard and whatnot, and I think we can influence that. The pure R&D work and having our labs work together again, it strikes me as less effective to have us all doing the same kind of work, where we could collaborate and fundamentally advance that work more efficiently and cost effectively. So I think that's super important. I think appreciating the obligations that we have in the multilateral context, whether it's under the IAEA or whatever, making sure that we're still adhering to the broad frameworks that exist out there, that we are kind of waving that flag that we want the world to see in terms of nuclear power and the future of nuclear. So I think that those are all important. Waste management would be another area, making sure we've answered the questions and that we look to the international standards there, that we can convince people that we have the science, that we actually know what the right choices are. Those are all things I think that the collaborative effort, creating that global voice, can really contribute.
So one last SMR specific question for me, and I think we have some more SMR questions from the audience, but the question I have for you is when does the future get here when it comes to SMRs? When do you think you start to see that future actually show up? Because I'm sure, as you've probably thought about a great deal, 2050 sounds like a long time from now, but actually it's not. So SMRs have to show up pretty quickly to have an impact. When do you think the first real SMR technologies are going to be available from what you've seen?
I think it depends on where you're looking in the spectrum, right? So for Canada, expectation that we want so on grid, 200 megawatt reactors, kind of a 20 megawatt micro reactor. I think they will advance, on slightly different pathways. For us, we would argue the time is now. That SMRs are part of the equation now, simply because if we don't make the investments, if we don't start making, the decisions now, then economies are forced to make other choices. So, for instance, if you're contemplating that, you're going to see the wind down of generation from a gas plant, and you're thinking in the next 5 or 7 years, you're going to have to make a choice about where you invest. People need to know that they can see new SMRs as an alternative choice. And so, I've had this kind of pushback a little bit about, well, SMRs won't come on stream until, kind of 2026, 28. And the full range of technologies probably won't be in the marketplace until the early 2030s. And so that's, we can wait to make the decisions. And I argue, you can't wait. We need to have the indicator. We have to send those market signals now so that people don't start investing in coal or gas-fired plants because they don't think they've got an alternative choice. So for me, SMRs are now. They're a real part of our dialogue.
Okay, the future is now. That's probably, I think I agree with that, because I think if people who think of this as being technologies we need another 10 or 15 years to develop, I think it's too late. I think decisions get made before that.
Exactly.
And I certainly get the sense that the vendors that I know that are active in Canada and other countries, they seem to be moving with a sense of urgency. So we'll see what they are able to accomplish. You mentioned the role of women, and maybe this is a little bit off subject, but I appreciate your views, because I do think that's something that in the NEA we have spent some energy recently, and probably will spend more energy in the next several months looking at the not just the role of women from a fairness standpoint, but really it's a big part of what I think could be the pathway to the future for nuclear, to become a nuclear sector that is more readily accepted by a broader number of people. And I think gender balance is one of the pieces that needs to be addressed. What's your view of that? How do you see gender coming into play in the nuclear sector?
Well, I mean, I think if I think broadly across the energy sector and we look at who performs best, it typically seems to be companies that have achieved a greater equity and a greater balance in their operation, because it is about harnessing all of the talent that's out there and having them at the table seems to bring better results. In Canada, women make up about 25% of the clean energy workforce, but only 20% of the nuclear sector's workforce. And so we have been, actively engaged in trying to figure out how we can do better. I think I might have mentioned earlier in this conversation, we launched the Equal by 30 campaign that is a global campaign I think we now have 150 signatories. We hope the NEA will sign on. But I think those are examples of where we just kind of need to raise consciousness, right? And we need to make people think about these things. But equally, as a science-based department, my department, NRCan, like we are actively engaged in women in STEM, and we are looking at how we can make sure that as we recruit, as we think about, what universities we're engaged with, those again are things that we want front of mind, that we are trying to find all of the different mechanisms that will allow us to increase the percentage of women in the nuclear sector.
Excellent. So we have a few questions, and I think we have time. And the first one maybe gives you a chance to reiterate something from an earlier conversation, and that is regarding the competition between energy sources and how you see the transition from where we are today to a future that is nuclear and renewables. How do you see that transition happening? And it's sort of a second part of the question from the person asking this is, what's your view about the fact that some countries still view this as nuclear versus renewables? Maybe you talked about some of this already. I'll give you a chance to reiterate a little bit of it.
Well, I think it is about how we set the table. So your report that's coming out, for instance, that talks about costing and that allows people to make sure that when they talk about renewables and versus nuclear, that we are having that apple to apple conversation. I just think that's so fundamental is make sure we're combating the myths that are out there. I think though equally, as I say, we need to kind of look at kind of the local. We need to kind of figure out what are the best energy solutions in a given country, in a given region, and make sure that we're making the smartest investments we can that allow everybody to kind of make the move towards net zero. In Canada's case, like we say net zero because we realize petroleum will still be a feature in our economy in 2050. And so it is about not just, eliminating carbon-based fuel from the economy, but how we manage it. So looking at carbon capture as an example, looking at other clean technologies that allow us to have influence. We also, as a major energy producer, in particular with respect to oil and gas, realize, if we can play a role in the global marketplace, particularly with our natural gas supplies, that may allow other countries to move off coal. And so, their choice may be simply finding a better fuel than the current fuel they're using. If we can get countries off coal, say, for instance, in Asia, if we can see LNG penetrate that market, that's good for the globe because that ends up, cleaning up their supply. And so we always have to think about the global marketplace as much as we do our domestic markets. As you know, we're a big country, but in terms of our economy, we're not developing SMRs or any aspect of our energy system exclusively for a domestic market because it's just not sufficient. So if we move on SMRs, it means that we see a global place for Canada in that, and that's how we want to be able to influence things. So finding that right balance, it means availability, it means making sure the technologies advance, it means that we understand their impacts, and that we're making smart choices at a local level to achieve the climate objectives of regions and countries.
Another question that I see, and this is kind of an interesting, do you believe that the general public in Canada is aware of the SMR conversation? And do you believe that they are really going to accept having these reactors sort of dotted around all over Canada? How do you see that?
So in Canada, it's funny, that part of the population that lives closest to our current nuclear generation are actually much more positively inclined towards nuclear power than those who live most remotely away from our current generation. I think that is something that we are really paying attention to in terms of how we advance that discussion in Canada, which is about making sure the population has the information they need to understand what's going on. And I think that part of that is this engagement process. What we're doing in advancing our action plan is bringing ENGOs, NGOs, corporations, governments at the municipal, provincial, and federal level, bringing them together into that dialogue so that they can challenge one another. They can pose the questions, and hopefully we've got the right people in the room to answer the questions. I think it's really a public education element of this that builds momentum.
I think there's time for this one last question, which I'm going to sort of repackage a bit because I'm going to help the questioner out a little bit. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to be holding a workshop that Romina Velshi, the president of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, is going to be co-hosting, is very involved in, looking at how other industries outside of nuclear have been able to deal with innovative technologies, technology breakthroughs, and harmonization of those technologies. For example, the analogy that's often used in conversations is if you have an airliner built in Europe, you're allowed to fly it in Asia and sell it to Americans. And you don't have to go through a recertification process every time you go to a different country. And the question is, well, why can't we do that with nuclear power plants? So I guess I could just say, why can't we do that with nuclear power plants? But I know the answer is more complicated than that. So let me ask you a very high level question. Can you imagine a situation where a technology, a new SMR technology, for example, is fully certified in one country, say the United States, a neighbor, and then quickly allowed to operate and be built around the world? Can you imagine the global framework accepting that as a practical matter, or do you think that's just something that we'll never be able to see in the nuclear area?
I actually can imagine it, and largely because I think these next generation technologies are going to be much more about manufacturing, and as we've talked about already, kind of the standards and what goes into ensuring that we are meeting the level in terms of how these things get manufactured. We're talking about fleets of small reactors as opposed to that 10-year construction of a gig reactor. And so indeed, I think Romina has done a terrific job of leading the way with the CNSC to kind of get them rethinking that this isn't going to be a reactor by reactor assessment. This is about understanding how we're going to create fleets of micro reactors and what are the standards that are going to have to be met from that regulatory perspective. And to that end, I can see that. Having worked at Transport Canada, we paid a lot of attention to kind of what were the best ways for us to make sure that there was a proper global standard. And so we did look to the Europeans and the Americans, among others. There was a small core group of regulators that did those certifications that had that global trust because of the work that takes place in the transportation equivalent or the air transportation equivalent of the NEA and the IAEA. And I think we can get there because I think that this is a different kind of technology. And I think that's part of the education. People have to understand that. We're not talking about a 10-year play, as some of my friends in the colloquium on the weekend kept referring to these white elephants. And I kept saying, but these aren't that. And we've got to kind of reshape how we think about what this new technology is.
Oh, outstanding. Well, I think I'm going to end on that very positive and optimistic note. I thank you very much, son. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate you spending the time with us and look forward to working with you as you go forward. I think there's a lot of very important issues there. And I do think that the NEA working with Canada and some of other countries, we can advance a lot of these issues forward. And again, look forward to that conversation about the Indigenous peoples. I think that'd be fascinating to have with you sometime. So with that, I'm going to just end this and thank Shawn once again and remind you that we do have a web event coming up soon on the projected costs of electricity.